What if everything you were taught about the exact moment of death was incomplete? What if consciousness does not simply vanish the instant the brain shuts down, but instead enters a hidden interval, a forbidden gap of reality that few traditions dared to describe? And what if, inside this interval, something extraordinary happens, something that science can't fully measure, but ancient Gnostic texts hinted at thousands of years ago? In the image before you, the body lies still, yet something luminous rises, an outline of pure light stepping into an unknown ring of energy. This visual is not just symbolic. It represents a question that has haunted mystics and researchers alike. What truly awakens in the 11th second, after the brain has released its final electrical impulse? Some scientists call this a neurological echo, but ancient mystics believed it was the soul reclaiming its original form. And if that is true, what does this transition reveal about who you really are underneath the layers of matter, memory, and identity? For centuries, religious institutions avoided discussing this hidden interval. It was easier to teach that life ends in a single breath, a clean separation. But the Gnostics, the mystics, and the keepers of ancient knowledge insisted on something else, that there is a moment after death when consciousness sees the world without the filters that kept it asleep. A moment when the illusions of the archons fall away and the true nature of reality becomes visible. The question is, why would such a revelation be suppressed? Before we go deeper into this mystery, into the forgotten teachings, the ancient testimonies, and the modern discoveries that point to the existence of this 11th second, I invite you to join this journey with an open mind. If you are someone who feels that there is more to existence than the physical body, if the mysteries of consciousness call to you, then subscribe to the channel and follow our hidden revelations. This community exists so that truths buried for centuries can finally rise, just like the luminous figure in the image rising from its earthly shell. For generations, humanity has been taught a simplified version of death. The heart stops, the brain fires its last signals, and consciousness fades into nothing. A clean ending, a flat line, a silence beyond comprehension. But when we look closer through scientific reports, ancient manuscripts, and mystical traditions, another picture emerges, one far more complex and far more disturbing. The real problem is not that we lack evidence. It's that many of these findings were ignored, dismissed, or quietly buried because they contradict the established model of human existence. The 11th second, that mysterious interval after the final brain impulse, is one of the biggest cracks in the materialist story, and yet almost nobody talks about it openly. If we return to the image that represents this video, the message becomes clearer. The physical body lies motionless, yet something luminous, something unmistakably human rises through a ring of golden particles, as if crossing a threshold the material world cannot hold. This visual mirrors accounts found in several ancient sources. Gnostic groups describe this transition as the moment the inner spark disengages from the psychic prison. The Egyptians wrote of the Ka separating from the flesh in a burst of light. Even early Christian mystics hinted that the soul was not extinguished at the cessation of breath, but awakened, suddenly aware, suddenly free. So why did these teachings fade from mainstream doctrine? Some scholars suggest these ideas were intentionally downplayed because they shifted spiritual authority away from earthly institutions and toward personal experience. If consciousness survives independently, if it becomes clearer and more aware after the physical shell shuts down, then the boundary between life and death is not a wall, it's a veil. And a veil can be lifted by anyone. This possibility threatened the idea that only certain figures or structures could interpret the mysteries of the afterlife. Instead, ancient mystics proposed that the truth was accessible to anyone who learned to perceive the subtle moments when the soul detaches. Modern research, surprisingly, supports fragments of these ancient claims. Doctors have recorded cases where brain activity appears to continue, sometimes even intensify seconds after cardiac arrest. In some studies, participants who were clinically dead described rising out of their bodies, observing the medical team, or entering a space of luminous clarity. These testimonies, although controversial, were so consistent across cultures that researchers began calling this interval the conscious echo. But Gnostic texts had already described something similar 2,000 years ago, a flash of recognition that emerges once the physical vessel no longer limits perception. Here lies the central difficulty, the reason this topic was pushed into the shadows. If the 11th second reveals that consciousness is not dependent on the brain, then the entire structure of materialist philosophy collapses. If the soul becomes aware right after the physical form stops functioning, then death is not the end, it is the first moment of real sight. And if this is true, if the Gnostics and modern witnesses align, then what else has been hidden? What other truths about human existence were simplified, altered, or erased to maintain a particular worldview? Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever felt, even for a moment, that your awareness is deeper than your thoughts? That there is a part of you observing everything, quietly untouched by time? If so, how do you make sense of that? Share your experience in the comments, because each person's perspective helps us reveal a larger pattern that has been concealed. When we explore ancient writings through the lens of the 11th second, something remarkable becomes visible, almost as if the philosophers, mystics, and Gnostic communities of the past were describing the same phenomenon using different language, each trying to protect a fragile truth from being erased. The problem is that most of these texts were fragmented, burned, or reinterpreted over centuries, leaving only hints scattered across different cultures. But once placed together, these fragments reveal a pattern. Humanity has always sensed that consciousness continues for a brief moment after the body stops, and that this moment holds the key to understanding the true nature of the soul. Take the Nag Hammadi scriptures, discovered in 1945. These Gnostic texts speak repeatedly about a transition of light when the soul recognizes its origin. One passage describes how the spark rises when the body falls silent, a phrase many scholars believe refers to the instant after physical death. Another speaks of the circle of fire the soul crosses as it reawakens strikingly, similar to the ring of golden particles in your cover image. The resemblance is so strong that it raises a question. How did ancient writers describe imagery that mirrors modern depictions of near-death experiences? Were they recording visions, symbolic teachings, or perhaps something witnessed across generations? The Pistis Sophia, another Gnostic work, describes hostile forces, the archons, who attempt to confuse the soul in this moment of awakening. According to this tradition, the archons create illusions to pull the soul back toward ignorance. Some scholars interpret this as a psychological metaphor. Others suggest the Gnostics were describing the disorientation that occurs when consciousness detaches from the brain, meaning the 11th second is not peaceful by default. It can be chaotic, overwhelming, filled with flashes of memory and emotion. The soul must remember its origin to pass clearly through this threshold. Outside the Gnostic world, the Tibetan Book of the Dead also hints at a luminous emergence right after physical death. It describes a phase called the dawning of the clear light, where consciousness becomes extremely vivid before entering the intermediate realm. Although this text uses Buddhist language, the essence is the same, an interval of heightened awareness immediately after the body stops. This is particularly interesting because these traditions developed independently, yet their descriptions align with modern reports from people who were clinically dead and then resuscitated. Even the early Christian mystics, long before the institutional church solidified its doctrines, spoke cautiously about a period in which the soul stands outside the body and perceives the truth. Some writings considered non-canonical describe luminous beings assisting the passage, while others mention a confrontation with one's own inner shadows. Later, these ideas were softened or removed completely, replaced with simpler teachings about immediate judgment. The complexity was lost, and with it, the acknowledgement that consciousness might continue briefly in a powerful and transformative state. The more we study these records, the more a troubling question emerges. Why did so many of these teachings disappear from mainstream tradition? Some historians argue that acknowledging a conscious transition after death would decentralize spiritual authority. After all, if every soul witnesses truth directly in its awakening moment, no institution can fully control the narrative. Others believe these teachings were simply too abstract, too mystical, to survive in a world growing more materialistic and politically structured. But here is the part that matters most for you. These ancient descriptions are not relics of myth. They echo the testimonies of modern individuals who reported floating above their bodies, witnessing scenes with clarity impossible for a dying brain, or passing through luminous tunnels that resemble the very imagery in your thumbnail. Many of these experiences last only a few seconds in physical time, aligning uncannily with the 11th second interval the Gnostics describe symbolically. Let me ask you directly, do you believe these parallels are coincidences? Or do you feel there is a deeper truth behind this universal pattern? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your interpretation matters, because each perspective helps uncover a truth that institutions long tried to bury. When we speak of the 11th second, we are not only describing a physical or neurological event. We are entering a symbolic territory that ancient traditions tried to express through metaphors, visions, and coded teachings. To them, the moment after death was not a blank space, but a battlefield, a place where clarity and deception collided. This is where the Gnostic idea of the archons becomes essential to understanding what happens to consciousness once the brain stops. Gnostic texts describe the archons as governing forces, not necessarily beings with bodies, but structures of control that shape human perception. They were said to build layers of illusion around the soul, limiting what it can see, know, and remember while in the physical world. These illusions create the sensation that we are only the body, only the mind, only the temporary self. According to these writings, the 11th second is the moment when these layers briefly weaken, allowing the soul a flash of authentic perception. For the first time, it sees itself as light, something reflected powerfully in your cover image, where a luminous human form rises surrounded by a halo of particles. The symbol of the energy ring behind the ascending figure is also significant. In many ancient cultures, circular patterns represented thresholds between worlds. The Egyptian solar portal, the Tibetan mandalas, the Greek halo of transition, and even early Christian art depicting the resurrection surrounded by a radiant oval. Scholars argue that these symbols were attempts to illustrate the soul's detachment at the precise moment when physical limits fall away. To the Gnostics, this passage was both a liberation and a challenge, because the archons would try to pull the soul back into confusion, not through physical force, but through memories, fears, attachments, echoes that mimic reality and trap the newly awakened mind. Modern testimonies curiously support this. People who return from clinical death often report moments of profound clarity interrupted by sudden waves of emotion or disorientation. Some describe being pulled back by unfinished concerns or overwhelming sensations. Others say they felt a presence, sometimes comforting, sometimes confusing, attempting to communicate. Scientists interpret these as residual brain activity, but Gnostic interpreters see them as evidence of the spiritual struggle described in their ancient writings. In this view, the 11th second is dangerous because truth and illusion mix in a single intense moment. So why was all of this hidden or softened by later religious systems? Many scholars believe the early church preferred a more structured, predictable view of the afterlife, heaven, hell, judgment, because these concepts were easier to teach and regulate. The idea of a liberated, self-aware soul rising into direct knowledge without institutional mediation threatened the foundations of spiritual authority. If every individual could experience truth after death without guidance, then no earthly system could claim control over salvation. Over time, the mystical elements were removed or reinterpreted until only fragments remained in official doctrine. This is where the investigative picture becomes unsettling. When you compare ancient symbols, Gnostic teachings, and modern near-death research. They form a coherent narrative that traditional religion never fully embraced. Consciousness continues, perceives, and awakens the moment the body dies. This revelation empowers individuals, but destabilizes institutions. It suggests that the true spiritual journey begins exactly when the physical system declares the end. Now, let me ask you something directly. Does this idea resonate with your intuition? Do you feel that consciousness is more than the brain? That some part of you would remain aware even after the body stops? Your answer shared in the comments helps shape how deeply we explore the next layers of this revelation. To understand what truly happens in the 11th second, we need to shift our attention from the body to the observer, the silent presence within you that watches your thoughts, your memories, your fears, and your life as it unfolds. This observer is what mystics across cultures identified as the soul, the inner spark, the divine fragment. While the body is bound by the laws of biology, the observer is not. And according to both ancient testimony and modern research, this observer is exactly what awakens when the brain stops functioning. For the first time, it sees without the filter of the physical senses. In your video's cover image, the physical body lies still, but the luminous figure above it stands upright, clear, and centered. This symbolism reflects a spiritual turning point described in Gnostic writings, the moment consciousness detaches from the dense material world and remembers itself. The Gnostics believed that during life, the spark of the divine was asleep, trapped beneath layers of conditioning and illusion. But in the transition after death, especially in those first seconds, the spark recognizes its true nature. The shock of separation actually clarifies perception, making the soul aware of its own existence in a way no earthly experience can achieve. Some scholars interpret this as metaphor, but others argue that the Gnostics were describing literal experiences reported by initiates who underwent near-death states in controlled rituals. These initiates described rising above their bodies, observing their surroundings with perfect clarity, and feeling more themselves, not less after leaving the physical form. The 11th second, then, becomes not a moment of disappearance, but a moment of returning to an identity that is not dependent on neurons, organs, or sensory pathways. Modern stories align uncannily with this view. Countless individuals report a sudden expansion of awareness right after clinical death. They describe seeing their entire life spread out like a tapestry, observing not memories one by one, but the essence of their journey in a single instant. Some speak of experiencing themselves as light, feeling weightless yet intensely conscious. Others say they understood truths about their existence that they later could not fully translate into words. Scientists try to explain this through neurochemistry, but the consistency across cultures, ages, and belief systems raises questions no neurological theory fully answers. This is where the Gnostic perspective becomes most intriguing. They taught that the soul in this moment experiences gnosis, direct knowledge, not information, but recognition. The soul recognizes itself as something ancient, eternal, and unbound. It recognizes the illusions imposed by the material world. It even recognizes the forces, the archons, that shaped those illusions. This recognition is what terrified certain authorities throughout history. A soul that knows itself cannot be controlled, manipulated, or confined within rigid doctrines. A soul that remembers its origin becomes sovereign. So what exactly awakens in the 11th second? The Gnostics would say, the part of you that was never truly asleep, the part that watched your entire life without aging, without fear, without attachment, the part that felt the weight of your struggles, but was never crushed by them, the part that has always been waiting for the moment when the physical shell falls silent, so it can rise, illuminated, like the figure in your thumbnail. But this revelation opens a deeper question, one that directly concerns you. If consciousness becomes clearer after the body stops functioning, what does that imply about your purpose in this lifetime? Are you here merely to survive, or to prepare the inner spark for that moment of awakening? Share your thoughts in the comments. Does this idea expand your understanding of life or challenge it? If consciousness becomes clearer, not weaker, after the brain stops, then everything we think we know about life must be re-examined. The 11th second is not just a moment that happens after death. It is a mirror revealing what consciousness truly is beneath the illusions imposed during physical existence. And if this is true, then your daily experience, your fears, your choices, your beliefs, even your suffering, takes on a completely different meaning. Imagine for a moment that your consciousness is not produced by the brain, but merely housed inside it. The body would then be like a suit, a temporary instrument through which the soul interacts with the material world. And just as you can remove a suit without losing your identity, consciousness may continue intact once the brain is shut down. This is exactly what many ancient traditions suggested, and modern research is beginning to support. If this is true, then the fragmentation, confusion, and emotional weight we often feel during life are not part of our essence. They are distortions caused by the physical filter. Your thumbnail captures this with powerful symbolism. The still body remains on the ground, wrapped in the limits of mortality, while the luminous figure rises free, unburdened, fully aware. This duality is not just symbolic of death. It represents the split between the false self and the true self. The false self is the one shaped by fear, trauma, and expectations. The true self is the observer that persists, the same one that awakens in the 11th second. Recognizing this difference during life changes everything. Gnostic teachings insisted that ignorance of our true nature is what keeps humanity asleep. They believed the material world was filled with distractions, emotional traps, and mental illusions that prevent the inner spark from seeing clearly. But they also believed that there were moments, rare, powerful moments, when this illusion weakens, allowing the soul a glimpse at its authentic self. The 11th second is the ultimate example of this, but smaller versions happen throughout life, during deep meditation, near-death experiences, overwhelming moments of intuition, or even sudden insights that seem to come from nowhere. So what does this mean for you right now, in your everyday life? It means that the clarity of the 11th second is not entirely out of reach. By cultivating awareness, reflection, and inner silence, you can begin to sense the presence that watches your thoughts. You can feel the difference between the mind's noise and the soul's quiet certainty. You can start to live with the awareness that you are not just passing through life, you are observing it, learning from it, preparing for the moment when the illusions fall away entirely. This also means that fear of death, the greatest fear humanity carries, loses its power. If consciousness does not dissolve but expands, then death is not destruction, but transition. And if the transition awakens the deepest part of who you are, then life's purpose becomes clearer, to develop the inner spark so it can cross that threshold without confusion. This is why so many ancient schools emphasize knowledge of the self, not as philosophy, but as preparation for the moment when the body falls silent. But let me ask you directly, does this possibility comfort you or unsettle you? The idea that you will one day step out of your body as easily as stepping through a doorway, does it bring peace or provoke deeper questions? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective not only enriches the discussion, but also helps others confront their own understanding of consciousness. As we approach the heart of this investigation, one question becomes unavoidable. Why is the 11th second so rarely discussed? Even though ancient texts, mystical traditions, and modern testimonies all point to its significance, the deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that this moment is not just a biological event, it is a spiritual rupture, a crack in the veil. And within that crack, according to Gnostic teachers, lies the truth about human consciousness that institutions, both ancient and modern, struggled to fully accept or control. The Gnostics taught that the material world is structured to keep the soul distracted, fragmented, and forgetful of its divine origin. They described this world as a dream crafted by lesser powers, the archons, whose influence creates confusion and attachment. This doesn't mean the world is evil, but rather that it is incomplete, like a mirror that reflects only part of the truth. For them, the moment of death was the only time the mirror shatters completely, leaving the soul face to face with the reality behind the illusion. That instant of pure perception, the 11th second, was considered so sacred and so dangerous that only initiates were taught the full meaning of it. What makes this even more fascinating is that eyewitness testimonies from near-death experiences align with these ancient descriptions in astonishing ways. Many people who were declared clinically dead report finding themselves floating above their bodies, observing everything with clarity. They describe hearing conversations between doctors, noticing details they could not possibly perceive with shut-down senses. Some report entering a space filled with brilliant light. Others describe meeting deceased relatives or luminous beings. These accounts vary, but one element repeats over and over: the overwhelming sense of awakening, as if they had been asleep their entire lives and were finally seeing reality as it truly is. This is where the forbidden secret begins to take form. Some scholars propose that the brain, in its final moments, stops filtering the multidimensional reality that consciousness is always connected to. During life, the brain functions like a limiter, narrowing our awareness to the physical world so we can survive and interact. But when the brain ceases, that limitation lifts. In that moment, the Gnostics believed, the soul becomes fully aware of the forces that influenced it, its own memories, its attachments, and even the illusions projected by the archons. If this is true, then the 11th second is not just a moment of clarity, it is a moment of confrontation. Imagine standing in front of a vast, cosmic landscape you never suspected existed. Imagine suddenly understanding the meaning of your choices, your relationships, your fears, and your deepest wounds, not in a step-by-step analysis, but in a single burst of awareness. This is the experience many ancient mystics described. In fact, some initiatory schools tried to simulate near-death states to help their students prepare for this overwhelming flash of truth. They believed that only a soul capable of recognizing the illusions of the material world could pass through the threshold without being deceived or trapped by the archons' confusions. The image you chose for this video perfectly captures that revelation. The body lies motionless, symbolizing the end of the physical story, but the luminous figure rising from it is calm, centered, almost empowered. It is not confused, frightened, or disoriented. It is awakened. This is the ultimate Gnostic message. The soul that knows itself during life does not fear the 11th second. It embraces it as its first moment of true freedom. But here is the part that many institutions found difficult, even threatening. If the soul awakens after death in a burst of clarity, then no external authority can dictate what happens in that moment. Salvation, judgment, and spiritual liberation would depend on the individual's inner awareness, not on rituals, intermediaries, or dogmas. The Gnostics insisted that no priest, no temple, and no institution could stand between a soul and its moment of awakening. This idea challenged the very foundation of organized religion, which is why so many of their teachings were suppressed. As we uncover this hidden narrative, another question arises, one that affects every viewer watching this video. If the 11th second reveals the truth about who you are, who have you been preparing to meet? Have you lived as the luminous, aware presence within you, or as the distracted self shaped by fear and expectation? The Gnostics believed that the soul must spend its life remembering itself, so that in the 11th second, it will recognize the truth and rise unafraid through the golden threshold. This is why the revelations we explore here matter. They are not abstract ideas or historical curiosities. They are tools maps for understanding the moment that every human being will experience. And whether that moment brings clarity or confusion depends on the awareness cultivated during life. Let me ask you directly. When you imagine yourself in that 11th second, do you feel curiosity or fear? Do you imagine awakening gently into light? Or do you sense something unknown pulling at you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections help others confront this mystery with honesty and courage. Now that we have walked together through the hidden corridors of ancient texts, the forbidden symbols of the Gnostics, and the modern testimonies that echo their forgotten truths, one message becomes impossible to ignore. The 11th second is not the end of consciousness, but the beginning of remembrance. It is the moment when the soul steps beyond the limits of the physical world and sees itself clearly, without distortion. And this clarity, this awakening, is something that every person will one day face. The image that opens your video, with the luminous figure rising peacefully from its earthly form, is more than art. It is a reminder that within you lives a spark that cannot die. A spark that has witnessed your joys, your losses, your doubts, and your moments of courage. A spark that has been waiting, patiently, for the moment when the noise of the world falls silent and the truth of your being comes forward. The Gnostics believed this spark was the real identity of the human soul, indestructible, ancient, and made of pure awareness. Understanding the 11th second changes how we live. If consciousness does not end with the brain, if the soul becomes clear at the threshold of death, then every moment of your life becomes preparation for that awakening. Every act of kindness strengthens the soul. Every moment of reflection expands your awareness. Every time you question the illusions that society imposes, you recover a fragment of the memory that will guide you in that final moment. This is why ancient traditions emphasized inner knowledge over external authority, because when the body shuts down, the only truth you will carry is the truth you discovered within yourself. And this is where your participation becomes essential. By commenting, liking, and subscribing, you are not simply supporting a channel. You are helping keep alive a space where hidden knowledge can be discussed freely, respectfully, and courageously. You become part of a community of seekers who refuse to let these ancient truths be forgotten again. Your engagement ensures that more people awaken to questions they were never encouraged to ask, and that the spark within them is given permission to remember itself. Before we end, let me leave you with questions meant not to close the journey, but to open new doors inside you. If your consciousness becomes clearer after your last breath, what truths are waiting for you there? What aspects of your life will you finally understand? And most importantly, are you living today in a way that your awakened self will recognize with peace, clarity, and pride? Your search does not end here, begins here. Continue exploring these mysteries with us, and let your own awareness guide you toward revelations no institution could ever fully contain.